Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about some unpopular fantasy opinions. So I spent a little bit of time in my introductory video talking about the things that I like about fantasy, the goals that I had for the channel. But I think a really good way to get to know someone and to get to know their reading habits is to find the opinions that stand out, or the opinions that seem to stand out amongst a sea of similar thoughts. So we all have these differences in opinion. We all have thoughts or preferences about fantasy and about reading and about everything that differ from other people. And I personally find those types of things and these types of videos really interesting and unique. So today I wanted to share 6 of my opinions that I think are unpopular in the fantasy realm, or at least from what I have seen in the corner of BookTube that I inhabit. So I'm going to start out with one that's very specific, but also probably a little bit polarizing, and that is going to be centered around the First Law trilogy. So I think it is common knowledge on BookTube that Joe Abercrombie writes great characters. And personally, after reading the First Law, there isn't a character in that book that I think is poorly written. I enjoy all the primary characters, the secondary characters, even the ones that I really hate, which I don't know if they match up with the other ones that people really hate, but they're really well done. Another opinion about these characters that seems to be almost unanimous within the book reading world is that Glokta is the best character in the First Law trilogy. And I disagree. I really like Glokta. Again, sometimes I feel like the internet world, or at least the people who decide to comment on things on the internet, are like Sith. They only deal in absolutes. So if you say that you don't love something, then that must mean that it is horrible, or you hate it, or any number of disparaging things. But that is not true. I really like Glokta. But Glokta is not my favorite character in First Law. He is probably my least favorite primary character that we follow. Logan Ninefingers is my favorite character, personally. He is the character that I like to read the most about. His sections were always my favorite section of the novel. But I also preferred reading about Jezal to Glokta. And this is a profoundly personal thing. I really don't like torture. I think it was interesting the way that Joe Abercrombie approached Glokta and built up his character. But he still wasn't my favorite. I did enjoy his internal monologues. I did think that he had a lot of really funny lines, but the overwhelming love that people have for him on BookTube and just in general, though it may be deserved, I do not stand amongst those ranks with you. For something a little less personal, but probably just as polarizing or just as likely to incite a reaction, is I totally disagree with this idea that Stephen King can't write a decent ending. Now, I know that this kind of stretches beyond fantasy because most of what he writes is not fantasy. The novels of his that I like the most are either fantasy or kind of toe the line of fantasy, but I like a lot of his other stuff too. But I think this idea around Stephen King and his inability to write endings, it exists in the same vein as this idea that, for example, the First Law has no plot. The First Law is sparing in plot. It is a character-focused novel. The characters drive the narrative, but there is a plot. And I think what happens is that you get people who have really strong opinions, and then those strong opinions become really loud, and then those really loud opinions become accepted. And this is an idea, just to kind of throw back to my wrap up from last month, but this is an idea that gets explored in the book Thinking Fast and Slow. It talks about how people who have kind of the loudest opinions are usually the people whose opinions become accepted as fact. And this is why the kinds of personalities who like to yell about the same things over and over and over, once we hear that cognitively for so long, we begin to accept it as part of reality. And I honestly think that this is what happened with Stephen King. I personally really like his endings. I like the ending of The Dark Tower. I think it's very fitting for that season. Do I like all of the things that happen on the road to the ending? Maybe not, but I still think that it's a very satisfying ending. I like a ton of his endings. I think that they're often they're these very kind of open-ended, nebulous endings where you have to read into what happens, or you know that something horrifying or awful is going to happen, but you don't know precisely what. And I'm okay with that. So I don't think that being open-ended means that you can't write an ending. I think it acknowledges that people's stories don't always have an ending. Life goes on, the world moves on. And I think that Stephen King is very accepting of that idea, and that is incorporated into a lot of his stories. So as where some people might think that that's kind of lazy writing or it doesn't finish the narrative, I like it. I think that it is purposeful. I don't think it's because he kind of runs out of steam or he's not sure where to go. You are welcome to disagree with that, but I will stand by that opinion very happily. And while we're on the topic of things that would be likely to make a lot of people upset, I am going to throw out another unpopular opinion here, and it is about Grimdark. So I find it really hard, first of all, to say the word Grimdark because my husband, whenever I say it, my husband laughs because he thinks it is the edgiest name for a subgenre of fantasy. And I can't really disagree. I don't have a problem with it, but it just makes me giggle because I can picture his face as I say it to him. But I personally think that the absolute grimmest, bleakest Grimdark, for me, does not raise the stakes in a story. It actually lowers the stakes. And I again acknowledge that this is purely psychological. So when we read stories, and I think the reason that Grimdark has gained so much traction is because it veers away from that predictable fantasy template that we have that started with Tolkien and kind of evolved over the years. What Grimdark did was throw something totally new into the fantasy mix and focus on these morally gray characters whose actions we can't reliably predict, and plots that we can't reliably predict because we have these kind of chaotic characters who are driven by their own ambitions, by their own greed, who make the same types of decisions that humans do. And just like we can't predict the future in the world, it also makes it very difficult to predict what is going to happen in these books. And for a lot of people, this really raises the stakes of the narrative, of the story. We're not sure who's going to make it through. We're not sure what's going to happen, what decisions they're going to make. And I totally understand how a lot of people find that exciting, how it increases their enjoyment of the series, and I can totally see why this subgenre has become so popular. I also really like reading in this genre. It is not my favorite, but I do like a lot of the kind of classic grimdark stories, and I'd be happy to read more. But there comes a point in kind of the bleakest stories, and I feel like this happened with Dark Age by Pierce Brown for me. There reaches a point where things begin to get so grim that I feel like I become uninvested in the story. I guess I'm trying to protect myself because I get really attached to characters, and especially in the Red Rising series, there are some characters that I love in that series. But out of some kind of psychological need to protect myself from the hurt that could potentially come, I just repress all of those emotions and I start to not care at all. So I stop caring who lives, I stop caring who dies because I don't want to feel the emotional fallout of the things that might happen. And again, this is intensely personal. I'm not saying that this is how Grimdark should be for anyone else. This is just why I have a hard time with it. I do like stories that can kind of balance that edge. And The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne, which I just finished, is a story that I feel like did this really well. The stakes were high. I wasn't sure who was going to make it, but I was also like pretty sure that people that I really liked were going to make it through because, you know, it has that undercurrent of good versus evil and justice and all those things. And while that does in some ways make it a little bit more predictable, it also saves my heart the anguish. Now, people that I cared about also died in that series, so like clearly it was still going to happen, but it doesn't feel as bleak and as dismal as some of these really, really grim stories. And for that reason, for me, I feel like when you get kind of to that absolute end of grimdark fantasy, the stakes for me just kind of evaporate, and I don't feel any of that tension or any of that enjoyment anymore. To shift focus to something that comes up fairly often, so I'm not sure how unpopular these opinions are. These might be ones where there's kind of like two distinct camps and you can fit in one or the other. But I am definitely a person who prefers soft magic to hard magic. And this probably has to do with the type of fantasy that I prefer. I love historical fantasy. I love fantasy that's focused around nature and people who can manipulate nature and their magic comes from nature. I love those types of stories. I would prefer them to almost any other subgenre of fantasy. And so I tend to prefer soft magic systems to hard magic. To me, hard magic feels like science, and I love science. I just love magic more. So I feel like, to me, soft magic is magic. It's unpredictable. It's volatile. We can't explain it. We don't have a system to comprehend it. And I like it when the people in the story also feel like that. Because if magic were real, and when I think of and I try to conceptualize magic, that's what it means to me. The magic of a Brandon Sanderson, or those very highly developed, very rules-based magic systems, again, I can really see the appeal. People like to have stakes. They like to have consequences. They don't want these huge kind of power imbalances, or for magic to just come in as this foil to be able to run the narrative or displace whatever is happening or save the day. I understand why hard magic systems fill that gap and why people enjoy them for that reason. But for me, it just makes them lose a little bit of what makes things magical. It feels a little bit more like science fiction and a little bit less like fantasy. It feels a little bit more like the scientific method and a little bit less like magic. So I personally enjoy soft magic over hard magic, but obviously I am a fantasy fan. I like both. I just prefer one over the other. In a similar vein, I tend to be someone who thinks that less is more with world building. I have a really hard time with info dumps. I have a really hard time with clunky prose where, you know, we walk into a classroom and someone describes your entire political system, or you have a parent who's telling a child a bedtime story and this is how we introduce the politics of the world. I like world building that kind of builds up slowly, that gets introduced through character interactions, through use of language, through the ways that people carry out their day-to-day tasks. The type of world building that I tend to like, it leans on the lighter side. And I think this is why I have had a little bit of a harder time getting into Brandon Sanderson than a lot of other people. Obviously, he is like the most beloved author on BookTube. And while I have enjoyed the things that I have read by him, it hasn't made me want to race out and read Mistborn or race out and read the Stormlight Archive. Now, once I read those series, I may totally change my mind. I might be back here to do another video to say, you know, past there, I didn't know what she was talking about. She clearly just was not well read enough. And if you also feel that way, then that is perfectly fine. But I just have a difficult time with these huge dumpings of world building that don't feel nuanced. They feel as subtle as an anvil to the head, and I find it really difficult to wade through. This is also why I haven't started the Wheel of Time, because I've heard that that can be difficult from that perspective, that we get the most minute detail and that helps build this really rich and complex world. But that's not really what I care about. At the core of any story, I care about the characters. I care about the characters far more than I care about any amount of world building. I do not need to know what the religious history of the world is. I do not need to know what happened 8 centuries ago. I need to know the things that are relevant to the plot, and I need to know the things that have made the characters the way they are, but I don't really care that much about the rest of this stuff. Sometimes I do find it really interesting, but I am a fantasy fan for the imaginative stories and the character building. And because a lot of these opinions have been more on the controversial side, we will finish with something that is very lighthearted and fun. And I will just say that contrary to a lot of the opinions that I read online, I actually really like it when there are poems and songs in fantasy. And what is more, I like to read them out loud. If I'm reading to my kids, I like to read them and sing them. I'm not a very good singer. They don't always enjoy it that much, but it does make the experience more fun. So the reason that I thought of this one is because we are just reading The Hobbit together right now, and it's been a lot of fun to read those songs. They particularly loved the That's What Bilbo Baggins Hates song at the beginning of the story, and now kind of run around the house singing it to themselves. So I like it when those types of things are in novels. Even when it's not fantasy. I actually did a research project in university. I guess not a research project, a research paper. I wrote a paper analyzing different novels that have writers as their protagonists and the excerpts of the writers' work that's within the novel and what that means and what it means for their character, how it reflects the changes along the course of the novel. And it's always been something that really interests me. I think when authors put in poems, songs, snippets of characters' work, it can help really build up that character's motivation, give us insight into their psychology, into their patterns of thinking. And I really like that. I, again, like for the 10,000th time this video, I am a very character-focused reader, and that's what I love about stories, is figuring out what makes these characters tick, and I love falling in love with them. So anything that can help flesh out their personality, can help build them into a more complex character is something that I am likely to really love. But that is it for all of the unpopular fantasy opinions that I have. This just seemed like a fun way for anybody who is following along the channel or anyone who stumbles upon the channel to find out a little bit more about me and about my reading tastes. I would love to know any of your unpopular opinions, or if you think that any of the ones that I just talked about were crap. I am okay with that too. But have a good day, and I'll see you with another I'll see you with another video soon. Bye.